I've been with green cover the last almost 5 years. Green cover, we specialize in cover crops and especially diverse cover crop mixes. And there's been some alluding to the benefits of multi-species already, so I'm really excited to do this talk for you all. I wanted to circle back to the previous presenters with just a couple of things. First and foremost, my work of talking about multi-species cover crops and why everybody should be using them has already been accomplished for me. So just driving up was a mic drop of seeing so many different plant families and species growing so well together. And so just as we look around, I think the case has been made already. So a wonderful place to be for today. Another thing was the question that was asked during that first talk about the benefits of multi-species. And I thought Dr. Flater did a great job of describing that. I believe you said one is better than none and more is better than one. And we're going to talk about that today. You also mentioned that each plant is producing a different compound. So with that, I want to just elaborate on those ideas that have been discussed already. And once again, we're going to cast the vision for the benefits of multi-species, comparing it to a meal. So I want you to start by thinking about the best meal you've ever had. Now this question is not asking what is your favorite food, because I don't want a singular answer like a steak or this pizza from this one place, but your favorite meal, dining experience, what were all the factors that went into that? What was it like? What do you remember? What are the various elements that made it special? As you think of yours, I can think back to one of mine. My wife and I went to Dallas for a little anniversary trip. And we got to eat in this really cool skyrise overlooking Dallas. So wonderful ambiance. There were wonderful flavors throughout the meal. The service was exquisite. We were given a couple complimentary drinks for our anniversary, and then just course after course of just wonderful foods. So there were a lot of factors that went into making it such a special and abundant meal. I think that word abundance is important to think about as we talk about soil biology and with multi-species cover crops. So from this list, there are not only many factors, but most of these things are plural as well. We see an S here, we see an S here, S here, S here, and then ambiance, service, abundance, you can argue that those are all plural things too. A lot of factors going into that. So this is the same with cover crops. We're going to talk about lots of factors that go into answering why multi-species. And the one we're going to start with is the least scientific. Hedge your bets. You've heard the phrase before, not to put all your eggs in one basket, and that is true with cover crops, I believe, too. When you hedge your bets, you're putting a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here, because you don't know exactly what's going to happen. And that's the idea, too, when we're combining different seed species. There can be all sorts of factors going on, but when we think about this dinner, the chef has maybe prepared lots of different courses, knowing that some might be more adventurous for his diners, and some might be more of that meat and potatoes, the things that they're really comfortable with, they really want. We like watching this show on Netflix, Chef's Table, and they go through talking about different, or showing the stories behind different world-class chefs and their Michelin star restaurants. And at the end of each episode, they show all the different courses that they prepare. And some of them I could not eat. They just look too adventurous for me, perhaps, but there's other ones that look just amazing. And I think that's part of what we're doing too with this cover crop. So there are going to be factors like weather. And Zach mentioned in his area there's been a lot of rain this year. So much so that there's been catastrophic flooding in a lot of areas. But then there's also times where maybe all of a sudden it gets super dry. That could happen this year. We don't know exactly when we go from a flood to a drought, but it can happen fast. And by having lots of different plant species out there, for instance, a little bit of Japanese millet in a warm season mix, that Japanese millet can survive underwater better than any other cover crop species out there. So if we get one of those sudden floods, that can hedge our bets a little bit. Pests and disease. We are seeing this year in our test plots, I help manage our test plots in Behle, Nebraska. We've got field days coming up in August if you're interested, but in our test plots, we've never seen this before, but our flax, for whatever reason, is getting attacked by this certain fly, and it's just the flax right now, and we're not sure what's going on or why that is. Again, we've never seen it before, but if that flax is in a mix, even if the mix isn't resilient enough to keep that pest out altogether, it's probably such that the other species aren't going to be attacked in the same way, and so we at least have something continuing on. The other example is just the soil preference is going to be different one year over the next. As I'm working with producers, I encourage them to get out in your fields and observe as much as possible. Don't view the cover crop from the road, from the pickup. Get out in the cover crop and see what things are coming up. I like to ask what species are the all-stars and what are the duds, what are the no-shows. And what I'm trying to do there is be thinking about how can we make this mix better for the next year. But I have some people who will take the approach, and I really like this approach, of trying this same mix several years in a row to see what happens. I can think of one producer who has done this, and he has noticed his soils favoring different species over another. I can think of a time being in a walnut orchard in California. I was there consecutive years. Both times I was there, they hadn't actually planted a cover crop the year before, but with the seasonal rains that they get, there's always going to be some sort of heavy vegetation through the winter time. And the first time I was there, it looked like a full stand of oats. It looked like you could go through and harvest a crop of seed oats. The next year I was there, it was completely burr clover or burr medic, a legume that just because of what the previous year had done, what the oats had done for the soil, now it was the clover that was doing so well. So once again, the same soil can require different things at different timing, and we want to hedge our bets. Again, the least scientific thing that I could explain to you today, but it all starts with getting a good stand out there. If we don't have plants out there collecting sunlight, none of the other benefits that we're going to talk about are possible. We have to make sure that we get something to really stick. On that note, just a quick aside, I want to mention that the idea of cereal rye alone, like Dr. Flater said, one is better than none, and there are going to be times where cereal rye is going to be the only thing that can be planted, maybe especially in this area. If we've got a late harvested corn crop and we can't plant anything until the middle of November, please plant cereal rye, and please don't ask about other species that can go with it, because I would suggest there are no other species that should go with it. One is better than none, but more is better than one, if I got that right. Better than some. So the other, this is perhaps the overarching reason of planting multi-species cover crops, is we can accomplish more goals at once. If we were to look at this delicious steak dinner, we see a wonderful steak, we see some asparagus, and we see some seasoned potatoes. We also see some other herbs and garnishings on the side. But what's going on here, what happens if we just eat the steak? It sounds like a pretty good meal to some people. I've probably eaten just a steak before and been just fine with it. I mean, that's a great way to indulge, but there's a lot of benefits from adding these other things. If we eat just that steak, we've got a pretty incomplete and imbalanced meal, and especially if we were to do that time and time again, we would eventually start seeing effects that maybe we don't necessarily want. So we love that steak, but we've got to put some other things with it to get a more well-rounded diet. The same thing happens with the cover crops. If we plant just one thing, we're probably going to get less balance and less overall benefit. Let's take a goal of compaction breaking, for example. Every cover crop conversation should start with what the goal is. And so if somebody has the goal of compaction breaking, you might think, let's plant daikon radishes, something with a big tuber, we're going to drill down in that soil. But this goal is going to be incomplete or imbalanced. We're going to see less effectiveness with doing that alone for the compaction breaking compared to if we were to add some sort of grass with it that can use its fibrous roots to find those channels that are harder for that radish to get to. That radish might hit compaction layers and just send its root to the side instead of continuing to drill. So we use grasses within that to still get even better compaction breaking. But if we have other goals at play too, let's say we want to have lasting residue, we want to armor that soil. If we have just radishes out there, your soil might be less armored than it was before you began, at least eventually, because that low carbon to nitrogen ratio plant is going to break down very quickly and even cannibalize some of that organic matter in the soils. So again, just another benefit of if we put a grass with that radish, we can have the lasting residue, the better compaction breaking from those mixes, even just those two species together. If we think about the meal that we're indulging in, and we go back to this picture, let's look at the plate. We've got the multiple foods that we talked about, but there's also all sorts of multiple flavors going on. If we were to think of the example of the steak, we've got the ingredient beef. We've got the ingredient, maybe the marinade that steak was soaking in. We've got the herbs and seasonings on the side there, maybe sprinkled on top. And then oftentimes maybe a little pat of butter to finish it off when we go to those nice steakhouse restaurants. So a delicious way to go. And I think we need to talk about macro versus micro within this context. Those two words are not a foreign topic. When we talk about crop nutrition, we're talking about macronutrients, NPK, and we're talking about micronutrients. And especially within this crowd, there might be a greater recognition of some of those micronutrients. So when we think about that steak there, we want that beef to be the main ingredient. We don't want to eat, we don't need to have that garlic be a macro ingredient. Matter of fact, if we do, we're probably not going to be there's going to be all sorts of things that we would not want to happen if we eat just that garlic. So the same thing is true with cover crop mixes. This is a pie chart showing maybe our warm season soil builder, and you can see some things are more represented than others. There are cowpeas, there are sorghum sudan that are more dominant in this mix than, for instance, the flax, the okra, maybe the buckwheat. We don't need those ingredients to be the dominant species. We can have a lot of benefit from them even on a smaller scale. They're all important still. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why in a little bit here. So another thing that I want to present is the idea of not just all of those foods, those flavors, as they reach our tongue, but even before they get there. So has anybody been to Raising Cane's before? I think they probably have those in Des Moines. This is a delicious meal, and this is the spoiler alert that we're going to compare it to. So we've got a meal that's providing some of the essentials. We've got our meat and we've got our starches. A common diet for a lot of us, maybe. These, while providing many benefits, are still incomplete, they're imbalanced. And as it meets the eye, we've got a monochromatic meal here. We've got the cane sauce, which is tan. We've got the chicken strips, which are tan. We've got the toast, which are tan. We've got the fries, which are tan. And you say, but we've got our slaw, but as, I mean, if you know Cane's, you're probably subbing the slaw for an extra piece of toast, butter on both sides, and you're going to have what's even more tan. So we contrast that with the idea of a rainbow salad, where we're adding lots of different ingredients, which are all sorts of flavors, textures, colors, and this is going to be something that I don't know if you see that meal and you're more excited to eat it than this meal. That's up to you. I probably go back and forth even, but we could ask the question, what about our gut? What does our gut want? And I think that we could all say that we're probably going to feel a little bit better after we eat this meal. Green Cover hosted Christine Jones for a 2-day field day in south central Nebraska a couple weeks ago. And one of the days we had grain bowls for our meal. And right after lunch, sometimes we get a little bit lethargic. We fill up on delicious food and then we're ready to take a nap. And it's hard to keep the learning going in an environment like that. But with the grain bowls, it was noteworthy how people were still energized, they were tuned in, they were engaged. And we get that from this more vibrant dinner over here. So we talked about cereal rye, and I'm going to suggest that this is our monochromatic option. We still have some of those benefits. We certainly get a lot of the conservation benefits. So this soil is armored, there's living roots in there. We're continuing to collect sunlight and photosynthesize, turning that into sugars for the soil. So there's a lot of good to this. But once again, if we had the opportunity to provide our soils that rainbow salad, I think they'd be a little bit happier still. So here's that rainbow salad. We've got oats, we've got flax, we've got peas, I think there's some brassicas in there, there's some hairy vetch. This is a mix that is just more robust, and each plant is providing a different compound to the soil. Here's our rainbow salad. As we think about that dinner that we had, that wonderful dinner, there's probably different courses that you had. Maybe it started off with an appetizer and a drink, and eventually you had a salad, and then the main course and the dessert. The idea is to start the dinner as soon as you can be eating and keep the good times going throughout your time at the restaurant. That same thing applies to maybe a multi-season or a full season cover crop, and this is an example in a more arid environment than here, but we can see the pearl millet, and probably for as big as this picture is, maybe that's all that we can see. But if you trust me, there is sun hemp in there, there are clovers in there, there are some small grain cereals in there, there are plants in there that are going to be first thing out of the ground. There's going to be plants that come a little bit later, and then there's going to be plants that start filling in even more as that pearl millet starts breaking down. That's the multi-course meal that we can provide for that soil. Now this sounds all fine and well, but it's hard to do that maybe in Iowa when we're growing corn and soybeans. And that is probably true. I just want you to expand your imagination for a minute and think about full season cover crops. I heard a professor in Illinois, and they've got good soils and good crops in Illinois too. He was talking about a regen year with cover crops alone. If you were to do this, followed by the cash crop the next year, in an organic situation, he was making the case that you could be more profitable by taking one crop that second year rather than a crop each year. Don't come to me saying that that is or is not possible, but just throwing it out there that that is a possibility in that organic situation. Another example, full season grazing, and this is a lot like the regen year. We're just adding livestock to it. I would say this enhances further by adding another phase of life, like Zach talked about, another kingdom. So we've taken something that's growing multiple seasons, and we're responsibly grazing, we're management intensive grazing those livestock across it, trampling in a lot of that biomass and cycling a lot of that through the animals, maybe even upgrading it to a more usable form for the next crop. I've got conservation and wildlife programs on here too. I'm sure there's probably people in the room who have taken advantage of some of these programs as well. I heard about a great program through Pheasants Forever, at least in some counties, and a really intriguing option to diversify the rotation, at least on some acres. Another one that we're getting a lot of calls about, this is the season for it, those small grains are being harvested, and I didn't drive by any wheat fields on the way here, but more people are having a little bit of cereal rye on a field that they're maybe taking for some grain, or if wheat is in the rotation, if oats are in the rotation. Summer harvested crops that leaves behind a big window to grow a lot of different plants. And I would say that during this time, almost any species is an option. We can start adding in cool season species. It's too early for them, so we're going to use the warm season species to be the first thing out of the ground. Those cool season species fill in a little bit later. We've got something that's extending that window of feeding the soil microbes through the sugars being produced by all of these different plants. And then once again, it needs to be mentioned that even just that rye is at least a second course that we provided. So that corn, that soybeans, that was the first course. We're continuing that meal by at least adding cereal rye. Please still at least do that. So the last point of why we should be looking at multi-species is unlocking new potential. And the benefits that we've talked about, so far it seems that they would be stacking benefits. But we don't want just stacking benefits, we want compounding. When we're saving, when we're putting away money and investing it, we don't want it to just stack on top of itself, we want it to compound and grow with time. And something similar is happening when we reach the right thresholds of diversity in our soil, the diversity in our seed mixes. This is synergetic. There's new things that are starting to happen, and one of the processes that this comes down to is called quorum sensing. I mentioned that we hosted Christine Jones at Green Cover a little while ago, and we were fortunate to have people travel from all over the place to be there, and she's really championed quorum sensing within the soil health realm. Quorum sensing has been around for some extended period of time, but she's been one who's really applying this to the conversations that we're having. And I'll share just a few things that she's written in an article that she did for our Soil Health Resource Guide. This article can be found on our website. If you just go to the main screen, you'll see the magnifying glass, search quorum or quorum sensing, you'll find this article, which will be a gateway into other resources, I'm sure. But what is it? In the microbial world, the term quorum sensing refers to density-dependent coordinated behavior that regulates gene expression in the microbial population and or in the host plant or animal. We've got lots of different microbes that are all coming together to create new functions. New things are starting to happen. The lights are coming on. And to continue on with this idea, I'll read just a couple other things that are happening, hopefully making a little bit more sense of it. Think of how the bee behaves a little bit differently on its own, maybe flying through some of these flowers here versus if we were right by that hive. There's going to be a different level of activity, different things are going on just by having quorum with those other bees. Similar things can happen in the bacteria or within the soil. Quorum sensing in the soil microbiome enables multi-species crops and pastures to function more effectively than monocultures. Just quickly on that, I think we could throw pretty much any type of weather event at this field around us here and it would be just fine. There is going to be something that is growing no matter what. Maybe some things don't like the extra moisture, some things don't like the drought quite as much, but there's always going to be something going on here. So just to mention to the pastures and the multi-species and the beauty that we see around us. The microbial community begins to function as a coordinated superorganism, that's the type of organism I want in my soil, and can perform tasks that individual microbes cannot achieve alone. Can perform tasks that individual microbes cannot achieve alone. Once again, that's what I want. Quorum sensing also helps explain how biostimulants, I think we could throw in compost tea and all these different products that we're talking about into that, improve plant health even at very low concentrations, that was mentioned. The biochemical signals mimic plant and microbial diversity, resulting in the production of growth stimulating and plant protection hormones. Plant protection was mentioned earlier. One last quote here, and we're going to come back to this one. Quorum sensing adequately explains the extraordinary results such as abundant nutrient availability and enhanced drought tolerance, think of drought tolerance or circle that in your mind, observed once plant diversity and hence microbial diversity reach a critical threshold or tipping point. A lot of quotes, I think they're important. Go read the article to get the rest of it and to connect the dots. But as we talk about quorum sensing and we think back to all those other benefits, I hope that you're asking, why would this be true? How do we know this is true? This guy is from Nebraska, what does he know? So I'm going to ask you if you can think of how this has been true. We did that in the first presentation. Where have you actually seen these things coming to fruition? Where have you seen these things taking place? Once again, this field around us is just amazing. It was so fun before we got started this morning to go out into those, and there's great apps to help identify different plants. I would encourage you all to do that as you take in the beauty of it. So biomimicry is the idea of going out to nature and seeing what does nature want? How does nature do things? And nature does things in diversity. Obviously this around us here, maybe it was some great native pollinator mix that was seeded through some CRP program. That's awesome. On the way here, throughout all the roadsides, there was also wonderful plant diversity. A lot of these same species represented here. So great roadways, Iowa Department of Roads. So nature wants to operate in mixes, not monocultures. Well, let me give you a couple other examples of where I've seen this. Gabe Brown, he could be a famous guy. He did a cover crop trial in North Dakota where he planted single species and multi-species. We do the same thing with our test plots. But in his theory here, or in his study, this is what his turnips looked like about 2 months in. We see something that honestly is unrecognizable as turnips at this point. That 1 inch of rain was not enough to sustain this crop, and it looks really bad right now. Unfortunately, his radishes didn't fare much better. Maybe it's a little bit more recognizable, but still, 1 inch of rain was not enough for this to live off of. But, and you probably know where this is going, he planted a multi-species mix, and I'm just guessing that the same number of raindrops, the same rainfall happened over here, the same conditions, the same field. It's all the same right over here. What's different is that there's multi-species, and this drought tolerance that we're seeing could be a little bit of hedging our bets. There could be species that are more drought tolerant naturally that are doing better in this picture. I have seen this picture closer up, and I can also see that some of the brassicas that we looked at in the previous slides are also doing much better here. So there's something else going on, and I would suggest that that's probably the quorum sensing, if you will. So I mentioned that we do these same things in our test plots, and here's one of our strips of, I believe this was maybe collards. Collards planted by itself. Collards being a brassica, a cool season plant. These things really want temperatures maybe in 50 to 80 degree range. That's when they're going to be happiest, when they're going to grow best. So when we plant those things at the end of May and ask them to go through the heat of the summer, they're really not happy with us. We do so that we can demonstrate as many species as possible when we have our field days, but it's not the optimal time to plant these brassicas. However, we still think it's important to put these brassicas in a mix. It's adding not only another species, but another plant family. And here's what it can look like in a mix. These are maybe a little bit different brassicas, and there's some other wide leaves in that picture too, maybe from the sunflowers. But this right here is a brassica, and I will tell you as a theme, all of the brassicas look like what you just saw. But we see really healthy looking leaves there, something that has its full shape, maybe even a little bit bigger shape just because it's happier and healthier in this environment. That leaf is far more effective at collecting sunlight. That is a much more effective solar panel than the previous solar panels that we looked at as monocultures. So we've got something that's thriving in this system because there's other species around it. I'll give just one more example and we're going to close up here. Chase Thornhill is a grower that I work with in Northern California. He's a wine grower. He's actually the one that plants that same mix year after year to recognize that it is doing different things based off of what the soil wants that year. But Chase asked me one of his first years getting started, Davis, I want to get good at identifying these plants. So in addition to sending me this mix, will you send to my house address a little bit of each of these species? I just need a handful that I can see. I want to plant them by themselves and then plant the mix too. And he did the same trial that we did, just on a more micro scale, and his results were really profound. There are plants in here on this side that are hard to even think of how that could be the same plant, but sure enough, this is a faba bean right here, great cool season legume, and this is the faba beans over here. There are some different grasses that were in that mix. Not only are they puny, they're also yellow and not healthy looking at all, versus we see those same grasses here. I don't know, that's probably 3 times taller. There's just so much evidence of this being a much healthier way to go, something that's far more resilient. Even in a very controlled environment, there was enough quorum to make things start happening. So there's many reasons to plant diverse cover crops. First, hedge your bets. Make sure that you have something that is covering that field, something to be collecting sunlight and depositing that in the soil in the form of root exudates. Hedge your bets. get lots of plants out there for that reason. Also, accomplish more goals at once. Don't just decide that you need to accomplish this one thing. That's not true. There's all sorts of things that we can be doing at the same time, and there's so much opportunity on the table within a lot of rotations. I'll give that disclaimer again. Accomplish more goals at once. Feed your soil a richer diet. Remember, we don't want that monochromatic meal. Sometimes we want that monochromatic meal. There's a time and a place for it. But we also want that rainbow salad. The soil microbes need that rainbow salad. Feed your soil more throughout the year. Even when it's just dry, we're still feeding that soil more throughout the year. And what this does, so far through the talk, I've described soil and probably mean microbes a little bit interchangeably. All the microbes that we looked at under the microscope and these different things that we're adding, they're going to do better. They're going to stay fed when they've got feed, sugars, other nutrients, compounds through those plants. It all starts from the plants keeping things alive in there. And finally, unlock new potential through something that may be new, may not be new to you in quorum sensing. When we get the right levels of diversity, and real quick on that, this is not just species diversity. Don't plant triticale with your rye thinking that you've done what you need to do with multi-species diversity. You may have hedged your bets a little bit with that, but you haven't really added much for family diversity. Those are the same plant families. We really need to start looking at the grasses family, the legume family, the brassica family, and especially the what we call the broadleaf category, but there's all sorts of plant families represented in that. We've got the aster family, we've got rose family, there's all sorts of plant families, and we need to get more of that representation in there to have a more well-rounded, a more rich diet, and start getting that quorum sensing. So this is how to reach me. I would ask and encourage you guys to get a soil health resource guide from our table in the back corner. Those are a free resource. They include topics like quorum sensing, that was in a previous one, but there's all sorts of information in there. It really is just an educational resource more than it is a sales catalog, so please grab a copy of that. We've got one for everyone. With that, are there any questions? Probably still goes back to the one is better than none, more is better than some. In terms of, going back to the goal, what are the goals? If we're talking more about conservation methods, maybe one plant will suffice. When we're talking on the plant diversity for the sake of the microbes and what they're wanting, I believe Christine talks about at least 4 plant families would be really good. And once again, more is going to be better. So those plant families, like I said, legumes, grasses, brassicas, and then broadleaves as a general category. But the buckwheat family is going to be different than the flax family. That's going to be different than the sunflower and safflower family. There's okra that we carry to put in cover crops. So that's where we can really add a lot of plant diversity. I would say if it's possible to have a full season cover, or after cereals, maybe you've harvested some rye and want to put something in, get at least 4 plant families. There's no excuse not to in that situation.